Yeah. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So I'll do a quick introduction and then we'll get to some preliminary questions. So first off, hello to you, Garth, and to everyone joining us on this virtual author event series. Thank you for joining us for what is our second session of our Desert Foothills Library virtual author event series, which is sponsored by the American Library Association, thanks to a generous grant from them. The series is free and open to anyone who would like to learn more about our amazing authors. Coming up, we have Kevin Grazier on April 1st, and you can also watch a recording of our first session with Jordan Ifweko on the Desert Foothills Library YouTube page. So today, as you can see, we're joined by Garth Stein, who is the author of 4 novels, The Coming of Age Ghost Story, A Sudden Light, the international best-selling The Art of Racing in the Rain, the PNBA Book Award winner, How Evan Broke His Head and Other Secrets, and the magically realistic Raven Stole the Moon. He's also a playwright, a filmmaker, and a race car driver. In this event, Garth will be highlighting his new graphic novel, The Cloven. The Cloven Book 1 stars James Tucker, a genetically modified cross between a human and a goat known as a cloven. Book 1 follows Tuck's journey across the Pacific Northwest as he searches for his true home. And you can pick up your own copy of The Cloven Book 1 at Desert Foothills Library. During this session, at any time, please type any questions you may have in the Q&A section or the chat box. I will be closely following both. We want this to be very interactive. And starting off, so Garth, thank you for joining us. We're honored to have you today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So to start us off, you've had a diverse artistic career as a novelist, a documentary filmmaker, a playwright, as well as experience as a teacher and an amateur racer. So what inspired you to try your hand creatively at a new form with the graphic novel trilogy?
You make it sound impressive, like I have all these, I'm a Renaissance man, as opposed to just a scattered person that doesn't really have a true focus. I don't know what the difference is, but yeah, I've done a lot of different, worked in a lot of different media, and I think that the bottom line is that I've always felt that I'm a storyteller, and the story is what has to take precedence in everything that I do. And so the story dictates how it wants to be told, both from, a character point of view and, what the story is within the story, like internally, but it's also externally how the story is going to be voiced so that it reaches people in the most impactful way. That's the goal, right? So I actually wrote The Cloven. I wrote a first draft of a novel of The Cloven before I started working on a graphic novel, and it just didn't work. And part of it is because the mutancy of it, the idea of a hybrid, is difficult to write about in terms of discussing the anatomy of the lower leg, for instance. Goats have different bones than people do, and so it becomes kind of a challenge in that regard. And that I found that was sort of distracting from the point. It's like Gabriel Garcia Marquez says, who's a famous magical realist. He says, you can ask your readers to make one big jump and believe something, but you can't like make them do 10 little jumps. That's too much. But one is okay. And so the idea of a hybrid human goat person, okay, readers will buy that, but you have to keep reinforcing its legitimacy. And so after sort of a failed first draft, I gave it to my wife to read, and she's always my first reader, and she read the first draft of the novel, and she said, yeah, no, this is not your next novel. And I said, yeah, I feel that kind of too. What about if it were a comic book? And she's like, oh, I could see it as a comic book, because then it's just taken for granted. Then we're not worrying about anatomy. We're just seeing the character, and he's got, furry calves and hoofs. And we're not trying to like bore down on the. So in that sense, in this story, the story said, I want to be told visually. And so that's kind of how I got to the graphic novel format.
And telling that story visually and really kind of capturing what the Cloven look like, what life's like, what the reality is of the world around them. The artwork is gorgeous. You had Matthew Southworth, who's known for Stumptown,
Yeah.
do the art within the novel. How did you become acquainted with Matthew and tie him into the project once you realized it needed to be a graphic novel?
Yeah, of course. Once I said I wanted to be I want to do a graphic novel, I had a challenge. Right now, I'm not a visual arts person. I'm a literary arts person. I can't draw worth anything. So how do I go about finding that? Well, fortunately for me, I have written novels and have become, I'm very active in the literary community, especially in Seattle. And I was on the board of an organization called City of Literature, Seattle, which was, we were working to get UNESCO designation. There are two cities in the United States that are designated as cities of literature, which is part of their Creative Cities consortium that UNESCO has around the world. And they get together every year. They have like a whole convention in some great exotic land usually, and then people go and they talk about arts and how the cultures interweave. And so we were trying to establish that in Seattle. And one of my fellow board members was the associate publisher of Fantagraphics Books, which is really a tremendous graphic novel publisher located also in Seattle. They've been around forever and they've done tremendous things, and they're top notch in terms of the way they publish and the look and the quality of the art that they put out. So I had lunch with that friend of mine and I said, what do I do? How do I do this? And we talked back and forth, and he basically tried to say, don't, because it's a difficult medium in the sense of it doesn't, it's not as widespread as other mediums. And so therefore it's hard to sort of make a living at it. So it's really got to be a passion. And here I was coming in as the author of The Art of Racing in the Rain. Was I expecting to sell, 6 million copies of a comic book? And I really wasn't. I was just trying to like find the right place for the story. And the 6 million copies of The Art of Racing in the Rain gave me the luxury to do so without having to worry about, necessarily paying the rent and so forth. And so this friend of mine, Eric Reynolds is his name, said at the end of our lunch, we were getting ready to go, and he'd give me all this great advice. And then he kind of thought for a second. He said, you ought to talk to this guy, Matthew Southworth. He's up in Everett, which is about 45 minutes north of Seattle. He said, I think you guys would really hit it off. So I called up this guy, and we had an initial conversation that lasted 3 hours. And he confessed later that he got off the phone and turned to his girlfriend and said, that was a really great first date. And it was like dating. It's like we had to get to know each other. We had to learn each other's rhythms. And it turns out we vibed like perfectly. We got along wonderfully. And we both have passions with music and film, as well as literature and comic books. And his look, I found from reading all the Stumptown stuff, which was a great series that he illustrated that was made into an ABC miniseries. Unfortunately, it got canceled due to the pandemic, but I loved his way of depicting things in a realistic way, but also with such heightened edges, and it was very, it was a great blend, I thought. And he started doing some initial sketches for me and saying, what about this? And what about this character and this character? And I said, go. And so then we started working together, and the first book came out a year and a half ago, I guess. It takes a long time to make a graphic novel. I can write faster than he can draw, put it that way. So we're getting close to the end of our book 2. It's a 3-book series is the idea. The story is supposed to be a trilogy. And the next book, when we get the artwork done, it'll be out shortly after that. So, maybe, I don't know. I would love to say this fall, but I doubt. Probably a year from now is when we're looking at book 2.
Okay. And then working with him, so I know, like you mentioned, when you first met, it's almost like a first date, finding out mesh well together and can work on a project like this where there is so much of that back and forth and the artwork takes so long to develop. did both his style of animation as well as, just who he was and kind of his creative vision for the project influence how the Cloven turned out at all?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're really close collaborators in that regard because I didn't really know what I was doing, and he did because he'd done a ton of comic books and graphic novels and work like that beforehand. But part of the thing I thought was great about Matt I shouldn't say was, part of the thing I think is great about Matt is that um, he brings not only his own aesthetic, but his own view of storytelling. So he got a degree in playwriting, believe it or not. There we go back to the theater, and he did that, pursued that for a bit. Ended up working in LA for Tom Cruise's production company, and for many years ago, working on script development and stuff like that. So he knows how to put together a story, and he knows what the elements are needed. He also he's a great visual artist as well. So I could write things that in my mind work. But my mind is it's a novelist mind, so I can take 10,000 words to say something that if I were a poet, I would take, one stanza to say. That's part of what being a novel is. It's boring in on something and opening it up and like just really digging in on it. Whereas in this kind of a format, we have to move maybe a little more quickly. And also, the images carry a great deal of the story. And as a novelist, you don't have any images to carry the story. So you have to write everything. So what we found after book one was I was overwriting the script. So I would I write a script, and then Matt goes over it, and then he kind of makes notes and suggests some things, and then he starts kind of laying it out how it's going to look on each page. And that's also a very important aspect of a graphic novel, where things are visually located because of the way people read a visual manuscript, if you will, a painting. If you look at a painting, theoretically, now most painters are super talented, and they do this without thought. They do it intrinsically. But if you look at a painting, you understand that there's a narrative element to it that a painter is trying to draw your attention to certain aspects of the composition in a certain order, in order to kind of tell a little bit of a story about what's going on. That's what I learned about what Matt taught me. And that's the collaboration part, where he said, if there's a reveal of something surprising or something new, that's got to happen on the top of the page, of the left-hand page. Because if it's at the bottom of the right-hand page, you may start here because you're trained to, as a reader in our culture, to look up here, but your peripheral sees this, and so you're gonna look. And so if it's something exciting, you're not going to pay attention. You're going to go straight to here, right? But if I take this here and I put it on the back page, then I'm like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And when I turn the page, I get the reveal. So these are the sorts of storytelling tricks that I had to learn, and Matt really helped me kind of develop a sense for. We're much on our book two, we have a better working relationship in the sense that I know what I can expect, and I kind of know where the turns are going to be, and I know how the pacing is and all that kind of stuff. So it's been a tremendous thing for him to say, he'll email me and say, okay, I'm working on this scene. It's kind of like a scene that we had like 8 pages ago, and I'm thinking it's going to look redundant. Maybe we can cut this and just jump to the next thing. And I look at it in the script and I say, yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's move the things along. So it's been a real education for me in terms of how you lay out a story, how you tell a story, and how you really. This is a thing that I try and teach when I teach writing workshops and stuff. That you have to, as a writer, you need to depend upon your reader. You don't have to do all the work, and you shouldn't do all the work. If you do all the work, you're working too hard. Your readers are really smart. They're there to try and figure things out. For a reader reading a novel, for instance, you read the first line of a novel and it's a puzzle, and you're trying to solve it. and you're trying to figure out where it's going and why it's going there and what's going to be given to me and what I'm going to learn. And it's always going to be a little surprising, but always is going to kind of make sense to you. And you kind of, it's a real wonderful journey a reader gets to take with a writer. And so this is just another element on top of it that I have now been able to kind of add to my repertoire. And I'm curious, I'm working on a new novel now, traditional novel, and I'm thinking, I'm cutting scenes. I'm like, why do we need this? We can just skip ahead. And I was like, well, am I doing that because I've learned a little more efficiency from writing a graphic novel, series? So, we'll see. But it is definitely a collaboration between Matt and me, and it's a real gift to have someone that I can work with on that level, since I've never done it before, and otherwise I could be fumbling around in the dark for quite a while looking for light switches.
That's amazing. And as Deborah in our attendees said, it's an interesting psychology of reading. Real quick to the attendees, don't forget to put any questions you have either in the chat or in the question and answer box. Going along with kind of like, the psychology of how you approach it as a reader of a graphic novel, and some of what you've learned in that creative process. I noticed, like, reading through it, that it's a very non-linear story. It shifts back and forth within Tuck's life. Was that how you envisioned it from the beginning, or did kind of the format necessitate approaching it non-linearly and having some of those reveals and those surprises happen in that manner?
Good. It's a great question. And yes, I imagined this to be a back and forth sequence of storytelling when I wrote my initial story and when I worked on the initial script for the first book, because that's the way I tell. That's what I do. Yeah, if you've read any of my novels, I skip back and forth in time, because there's always layers when you're telling a story. And we do this as if we're telling a story around the dinner table or around the campfire or whatever. When someone starts relating a story, they will backfill with some info to kind of get you up to speed on a detail or something that's going to happen to prepare you to understand it. But they do it when they need to do it, not at the very beginning. I don't start, if I'm going to tell you what I had for lunch yesterday, I'm not going to start with when I was 5 years old, I had a peanut butter sandwich. But I'm going to say that yesterday I had a peanut butter sandwich and it reminded me of the time I was 5 years old and had a peanut butter, you know what I'm saying? So these sorts of, that's how I approach storytelling myself, that there's the power and the momentum of the now. And then we get to augment that and understand all the characters' intentions and motivations through flipping back to see where things come from. When I wrote that first script, though, I was going back and forth like crazy. And Matt read the script and he's like, yeah, people will go insane. They'll never be able to follow this in a graphic novel. I said, but they would in a novel. And he's like, yeah, in a novel, they would be able to. You're right. But not in a graphic novel, because you're sort of learning the storytelling, of whatever the particular story is, as you're deciphering it as you go. And so if you switch it too frequently, it boggles the mind of the reader, and the reader's like, I can't deal with this. I'm sorry. It's too frenetic. It's too schizophrenic. It's too crazy and wild. So he then explained to me this really cool thing. He's like, look, comic books are comic books, and graphic novel is just a fancy word for a long comic book, right? It was, in a sense, it was kind of a marketing ploy. The term graphic novel, I don't know exactly, I could look it up. I don't know exactly when it was coined, but it was around the time of Mao's and that book series by, I'm not going to remember. I'll think of his name in a second. But the Mao's stories, which are in big controversy in Tennessee right now because they banned them from schools.
I think his name's Art Spielman.
Spielman, yeah. Spiegelman. There's a G in there.
Spiegelman,
Spiegelman.
there we
Art
go.
Spiegelman. There you go. I went to see him, by the way, just as a sidebar. Art Spiegelman is this great little old dude with a gray hair and a beard. Wait. So before I had gray hair and a beard, I saw Art Spiegelman. I was like, oh, look, a cool guy with gray hair and a beard. And he did a whole big talk in Seattle, and he's an incessant smoker, and he needs to smoke on stage. He can't go an hour without smoking, and there's city ordinances that you can't smoke on stage in Seattle. So they had to convince the fire department that it was a performance art piece, and that he needed to smoke for his performance art. The idea, though, of the Mouse stories was that it's a comic book for adults, because most people think of comic books as kind of goofy superhero-y stuff, you know. And we got them off the rack in the 7-Eleven when we were kids, you know, for 15 cents or whatever they cost, 50 cents, whatever they cost back then when I was young. And you know, that sort of like is a way of sort of taking an important visual storytelling medium and marginalizing it and saying, well, that's for other people, that's for kids, or that's for teenagers, or that's for, but in fact, the visual storytelling medium is really impactful and has an ability to reach a lot more people. So this is my novelist soul coming out, which is I don't write haikus, I write long things, and so sometimes I forget where I am. What were we talking about? What was the question?
We're originally talking about, you know, kind of the structure of it, and then, you know, the nonlinear nature of how you're writing.
Oh, the nonlinear nature, right? So right. So this is what he said to me. He's like, remember when we would read comic books? Of course, I loved the Fantastic Four. I love Superman. You know, I loved all those things. And he's like, well, they're called floppies in those days because they were floppy, right? And they were very short and they were printed on cheap paper, and they used cheap ink, and they only used 3 colors and all this sort of thing, because it was about keeping the price as low as possible of production so you could make some money on an inexpensive deal. And those initial floppies were 24 pages.
I don't know what she was talking about. Anne said I had to come back and see a picture of Garth. Zoom call.
Yeah. Oh, so Garth, this is Augusta, who's one of our most amazing volunteers here at the library.
Hi, Augusta.
Nonprofit and largely volunteer run. So,
oh, Garth, they recommended we come and see you because you're so cute, and you are.
Well, thank you.
Continue your Zoom meeting.
In the old days, comic books used to be 24 pages because that's the way you do a folio. The books are always printed in folio form. There's a whole thing we could go through. It's not that necessary, but the idea of the pages and the way they're folded and the way they're printed and the way they're bound gives a certain number of pages to a certain kind of binding width. And so comic books in the beginning were usually 24 pages because that's how it would fold up. And so he said to me, look, don't go 5 pages and then cut to another time frame and then 8 pages and then cut to another time frame and then 6 pages. He said, that's going to be freaky for people. But if you could do a thing where you take like a 24-page chunk, that's kind of the rhythm that people have gotten into with reading graphic novels, if only because that's how they learned, right? Most people have read comic books when they were a kid, when they were a teenager, when they were preteen. And so they know kind of the pace of what a comic book takes. And if you give someone a Superman comic book, and say, here's a Superman episode, and they start to read it, and it's like 900 pages, they freak out. Because they don't have you're in a sense, you're supposed to be able to like take it in one reading and then go off and do what you need to do. Now, the pacing of life has changed a lot since the 60s and the 70s when I was a kid. When we had just more time to do things, it felt like the pace was just slower. Now, of course, to ask a kid to read 24 pages of anything, good luck. I've got my youngest kid is 14 right now, and I know what it's like to fight with the ever shortening attention span due to digital mediums and so forth. But this idea of a 24-page chunk or a breath or a chapter or a beat or whatever you want to call it really made sense to me. So I reassembled the story into these beats so that we could, you would feel like for instance, the first chapter of The Cloven could be a standalone floppy. We even thought of doing that. We thought about like putting out like it as individual chapters. That doesn't make sense in today's publishing climate. It's just too expensive. But that's how I visualized it. I've got to create a story that's this long. This chapter, right, is going to be this long, and then I can go to a different time. And then I said, well, how do we know, Matt? Because we're not going to put. Sometimes we'll put up a little caption saying, 2 years later or 8 years earlier or something like that, because you can identify that for the reader. But we also wanted to develop a visual delineation. So you'll notice that there's always a change of colors and hues. The first chapter is going to be all kind of dark and greenish and kind of creepy. And then you go into, a red chapter, and then there's like a bright yellow chapter. So that we sort of signal subconsciously, subliminally to the reader that we're resetting here. It's something new. Clear all that off, open your mind, and let's go in a new direction. So that's sort of how we built the story to this, and it's worked. I think it's worked out for us so far.
That makes a lot of sense, and I didn't make the connection when I read The Cloven. I've read it a couple times, but having read Mouse volumes 1 and 2, I can kind of see the similar pacing between Mouse and The Cloven, having read both. And with the color delineation, there are definitely like parts that were kind of green focused and red focused, blue focused. And I did notice that like as it went from both different times, but also kind of like different feels to what was feeling, what was happening.
Yeah, for sure. And that's part of Matt's brilliance. And I say this and I say it to his face too. So I mean, I think Matt is fantastic, and he like has a feel, like just a feel for things, and he knows how to kind of use color in a very powerful way. So the color kind of becomes a character, or at least a great character enhancer. And so he can like say, this is going to be murky, and we're going to blur stuff, or we're going to like pop certain things out, or we're going to brighten the mood. And so I think it's and by the way, book 2 is, the artwork so far is just out of this world. I'm so excited about it, and we still have some work to go. The way you work in kind of the stages that we work in is that I write a script, we go over it, we tweak it, and then we set it. Now we can change it later, but we at least have a fixed, like, this is our, this is what we're working from. And then he goes and does his layouts, and we discuss that, like the pacing, that changes pacing and everything. And then when we're set on that, when we think we have like, this is the scope of this larger story, about 120 pages is each book, then he starts to work on what he calls the inks. So he does everything in black and white first. So that's all I've seen so far of book 2. Then when we have it all the way through in the inks, then we go over it again, and then I rewrite the script to the inks. Not the script in terms of the story, because we've already set the story, right? But in terms of the dialogue, because that's what's really important for me. In a sense, I deliberately overwrite the dialogue in the script that I give to him, because I tell him that. I said, look, there's too many words here. You want to use as few words as possible in a graphic novel. You want the images to convey as much as possible, and use as few words, because you don't want to have to like be fighting with the reader. Is going to see something and going to be making assumptions and thinking things, and you don't want to have to fight against them to say, well, this isn't really what's going on here. What's going on? No, they have to be organic. So then when I see his images, I can pull out a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the words that I thought I needed. So I give him an overwritten script knowing that we're going to pull out a lot of it. So I go through then now when he's done, he's going to be done probably next month with the inks. Then I'll have them all, and I use tracing paper on the top of it, and then I dialogue it. I do the bubbles so that he knows what should be said here and what should be said there. And I'll change things based on the fact that visually we have that information. I don't have to give as much exposition in the dialogue. Then when that's set, then he goes to work on the color. And then it's like crazy. I mean, when I first see the colors, it's like, what is going on here? The initial thing is, oh, I kind of liked it in black and white, but then you start to see more, and it just kind of like starts to explode, and you see like he'll do something that he'll maybe have a frame that I'm like, I'm not sure that's conveying, and he's like, it's not conveying it yet. He said, but I know what I'm going to do with the color, and you don't know what I'm going to do with the color, so you got to trust me. And I do. I trust him. And then when the color hits, it's like, oh wow, I totally get it. It's in a sense. Look, I write novels. It's a solitary job. It's kind of boring. It's, I don't see a lot of people. I don't get out of the house much. It's really kind of, I don't know. It's just a very solitary thing. So for me to be able to collaborate with somebody and have these sorts of things where they're bringing so much quality and inspiration to the equation, for me, it's the most fun. I love it. I love this process. It's awesome.
And what a great chance as well to like play off of each other and just really enforce each other's art. That's really cool.
Yeah, exactly.
So speaking of book 2, is there any insights or any little snippets you can tell us about book 2?
Yes. Well, book 1 kind of ends on a cliffhanger there a little bit. With that he has become self-aware. For those who haven't any idea what's going on here, the story begins with a young man, probably about 20 years old, we figure, and he is a mutant. He is a half goat, half human hybrid that was developed in a lab on Vashon Island in Puget Sound, which is off the. It's a 25-minute ferry ride from Seattle. And Vashon Island is known as an independent thinking. They're not quite in sync necessarily with the zeitgeist of Seattle. They have their own ways of going. And so that's why I said it there deliberately, because quirky things can happen on Vashon Island. A billionaire, there's a quirky billionaire in the Northwest who's made his money in the tech world and wants to experiment with certain DNA manipulations vis-a-vis CRISPR. If any of you don't know what CRISPR is, it's something to look up, CRISPR. It stands for something, I can't remember exactly what it is, but basically it's the idea of gene editing for very specific things, such as we could give you blue eyes if we just put the blue eye gene and we edit your DNA strands. We could make you faster, we can make you taller, we can give you certain colors. We could do all sorts of things with CRISPR. And one of the things we could do is try to end world hunger by creating a human goat hybrid. Because if you take a human and give them the digestive tract of a ruminant, well, they could eat a lot more different kinds of food. We as humans cannot digest grass, for instance. It doesn't give us any nutritional value, but if we're a ruminant, we have multiple stomachs. We can ferment that grass. We can get the nutrition out of it that we can, and then there you are. So that's kind of the idea that this guy's messing with the human genome. And then it doesn't really work. It's not quite right. They mothball the experiment, and all of these little baby mutant goat people who've been created in this laboratory need to be euthanized, because what are we going to do? Where do they belong? We're stopping this project. And one of the scientists says, I can't allow this. I actually have ethics and morals, and I cannot euthanize these creatures that we've created. And so he whisks them away. He spirits them away, and he takes them all up into the mountains, and he lets them go and says, you got to figure out how to survive on your own, but I couldn't see you, being murdered by these people. And so these goat people are left on their own and they start to procreate. And where do you go if you're a mutant goat person that everybody's afraid of? Well, you hide on the margins. And so some of this group end up living in Seattle, but in Seattle, we have a bit of a homeless problem. I don't know how much national news that has made, but it's a big problem in Seattle. And they don't know what to do about it. And one of the answers was to legalize urban camping, which I don't, by the way, think is a solution, but I guess the politicians in the Northwest felt it was adequate to a degree, which is to allow anybody to pitch a tent on any city-owned property in Seattle if you can't, if you don't have a place to live. I think we should build more affordable housing, quite frankly, and I think we should pay people higher wages so that they can afford affordable housing. Still, in Seattle, we have people living in tents, and the way the interstate works going through the city, it's kind of like a lean-to. It's built up against a hill so that underneath the freeway, there's plenty of cover from the rain and a place where you can stay dry. And several thousand homeless people live underneath this freeway. They call it the jungle. It's riddled with drug abuse, with crime, with prostitution. I mean, it's the dark element has taken hold. The city's conflicted about it, and yet nobody really wants to confront the problem. And that's where I thought that's where the Cloven would hide, on the margins, on the fringes, where people avert their eyes, because we all avert our eyes in our society. We all want to do good. We all want the best, but sometimes it's too dark. It's too much. We can't handle it. And so while we see it, we kind of do a little, that's somebody else is dealing with that, right? And so that's where the Cloven end up being. And that's where Tuck, our protagonist, ends up finding a place where he can fit in. And so really it's, the story is an allegory for all sorts of things. But most specifically, it's an allegory for, for those who have been othered, for those who have been pushed out of the mainstream because they are different in some way, not of their own, volition or, impudence or I just want to I'm striking out. It's just because other people have designated them as you don't fit with us, and therefore we're going to shove you over here and we're going to pretend we don't see you, and hopefully you can survive okay. And that's where the Cloven end up thriving in the Northwest. And that's, so this whole story is about, is in a sense an allegory, about people in Tuck's age range, teenagers through young adultness, who find themselves marginalized. And how do you then define yourself? How do you find your people? How do you find where you're comfortable and where you're accepted, and where you don't have to explain yourself all the time, and you don't have to hide your hoofs with plastic shopping bags? There are all these sorts of things in it. So the next book, after Tuck, ends at book one, he's now kind of Tuck has been raised in a very sheltered, as an experiment, he's been raised in a very sheltered environment, and he's escaped it. And he's learned that there are other people like him, other Cloven like him. And now he's realizing that this is maybe where he belongs, and he's going to try to integrate with them. And of course, there's going to be all sorts of deeper and darker conspiracies that go on. I will say that we've created a bit of an analog for, if any of our people here who are listening know anything about Bohemian Grove, we have definitely co-opted that and taken that idea and put it in the Northwest as another element of this. The Bohemian Grove, for those who don't know, is you can look it up on the internet. People know about it. It's a club that is in California, and it's in the middle of nowhere, and you can't be a member of the club. But if you're a very powerful ex-president or CEO of a Forbes 500 company, or maybe a member of the Illuminati, I don't know, then you get invited and they have certain protocols and there's a whole thing. It's really quite amazing. You know who broke it open and has a video of it that you can see online? Alex Jones. So that just kind of sets the table for you. We delve into the idea that maybe the surface of what we've been told in book one about what the purposes are of the Cloven aren't really the purposes of the Cloven. Maybe there's something darker and more sinister going on. So, and that will continue even through book three. And I think it's interesting that it's all come up in what's, you know, in the where we are now. It's funny that I was working on this story years ago, and so much has come true. It's like I can't even do these things in the story anymore, you know, with who, you know, Russell Brand, who says, look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but that doesn't mean there aren't conspiracies.
Yeah, but I know, like, there are even some like little hints at the purpose of the Cloven in book one. So it's curious to see where that goes. And then within the Cloven as well, like you mentioned, how it's kind of an allegory for people who are on the margins, who are othered. And even within the Cloven, I know they talk about how, you know, there's different types of Cloven. There's, you know, the urbans, the rurals, the domestics who are, you know, kept with, you know, regular people, and then the essentially lab rats who aren't able to experience freedom. Does that theme continue on, and how does that internal dynamic, even within a marginalized community, come to light with the Cloven?
Yeah, very much. There's definitely a categorization that happens in the book so we understand. So there's the urbans are the ones who live kind of in the city and kind of blend, they try to blend. There are some who are kept as sort of house pets by the wealthy, and those are the domestiques, which is a fun word that I took from the Tour de France. I'm a big bicycle. I used to race bicycles when I was in college, and so in the world of bicycle racing, you know, when you're doing a team event, there's one team member who's supposed to be, in soccer, they say the piano player, and then everybody else is a piano carrier. And so that's what the domestique is what they use in bicycling to say, yeah, I do my job, but my job is not to win. My job is to get this guy to win, my teammate to win. The one category I think you left out was the ferals. And the ferals are rumored to exist, but no one's ever seen them. And they may or may not exist. But the fact that Dr. Langner, who's the scientist who lets them go, the fact that he took them into the Cascade Mountains and left them out into the mountains suggests that some went some way and some went a different way. So in book two, we're going to be introduced to the ferals, and in book three, we will be with the ferals. The ferals would be a separationist movement. For instance, if you think of it as a political thing, you know, there are people who want to appease. There are people who want to, you know, fight for their rights and to be recognized as full functioning citizens. And there are those who want to create a separation and we don't even want to see you anymore. So we haven't even touched on the ferals yet in book one. In book two, we'll learn a lot about them. And in book three, we will understand the feral background.
Interesting. I look forward to that theme. We have a question from Cassie. She asked, are you a fan of, and I'm going to butcher this.
Nah, no, you're not.
And if so,
Dashiell.
What is your favorite work?
Dashiell Hammett. Well, of course, I have to be, because I have a son named Dashiell.
Oh.
And we named him after Dashiell Hammett. So, you know, my favorite work of Dashiell Hammett. I've read a few of his works. What happened with Okay, so I got like 9 things to say, and I'm figuring which order to say them in. I got to meet Dashiell Hammett's daughter or granddaughter. I can't remember. I think daughter, and they were up. There's a great theater in Seattle called Book It Repertory Theater, and they take books and they do translations of them into plays, but they don't do. It's not like a complete staging. They'll have some spoken word, so the characters will actually say things to the audience to kind of fill in. It's a really great kind of hybrid medium. Really, they do wonderful jobs, and in fact, they did a brilliant production of The Art of Racing in the Rain. And it was awesome because Enzo, a guy, was playing a dog, and he would talk to the audience, but the other characters couldn't hear him, right? Which is exactly what The Art of Racing in the Rain was about. Like, you're kind of isolated from certain elements. So they did the Maltese Falcon, and Dashiell Hammett's daughter came to that show, and I got to go and meet her and talk to her, and I said, we named our son Dashiell after your father. And she said, how do you pronounce it? And I was like, Dashiell. And she's like, oh yeah, he pronounced it Dashiell. I was like, no, we're going with Dashiell. Sorry. But Maltese Falcon, of course, is great. Any of the Sam Spade stuff is awesome. His depictions and his the world of San Francisco and that hard-boiled detective stuff, I think, is great and a lot of fun. And so I am a fan. Interestingly enough, what happened was we have 3 boys. My wife and I have 3 sons. 2 of them are older. They're out of college, and they've more recently out of college, but they're kind of on their own now. And we have our youngest, who's a freshman in high school. And when I was working on The Art of Racing in the Rain, we were talking about having our 3rd kid. We weren't sure, should we do 3? Yeah, maybe we should, kind of that thing. And I said, well, as long as we understand, honey, that if we have a 3rd kid and it happens to be a boy, I get naming rights, and I'm going to name him Enzo. And this was before I wrote The Art of Racing in the Rain. And she's just like, no, there's no way we're naming a kid Enzo. Enzo Stein just doesn't work. Italian, German, Jewish, no, it just doesn't work. And so we had a whole thing about this. And then it turned out that I started writing The Art of Racing in the Rain. And when I first started writing it, the main character, Enzo, the dog, was not named Enzo. He was named Juan Pablo, for Juan Pablo Fangio, and who's a great race car driver. And that's when my wife was like, you can't name the character Juan Fangio. People are just not going to take that. And I said, well, what would I name the dog? And she said, you should name the dog Enzo. And I said, yeah, but then I wouldn't be able to name this character. I wouldn't be able to name our kid Enzo. If you name a character in a book or something, you can't name your kid that thing. And she's like, yeah, you're right. You should name the dog Enzo, and we're going to get a better name for our kid. And we did have another kid, and we named him Dashiell, and I was totally into that because Dashiell Hammett, and I love having literary. Our oldest son is named Caleb, but his middle name is Zane, for Zane Grey. And then our number 2 kid is Eamon, and his middle name is James. And you can pick. For me, it's James Joyce, but I think for my wife, it was Henry James. So we can pick our own designee on that one.
So definitely some amazing literary names there. So you mentioned like how important, the setting of San Francisco was for Dashiell Hammett, and in your books, both in the Cloven and in your novels, Seattle definitely plays a role, like an important role in the stories. With, in the Cloven, you've got Vashon Island, you've got the jungle. You've got multiple locations in The Art of Racing in the Rain. How would you describe both how Seattle has kind of shaped you and shaped your writing style? And also, how would you describe the city for someone who may have never been to Seattle and is kind of first discovering it through your novels and your graphic novel?
Wow. That's good. That's a good one. Yes, I try to use I mean, when you're writing a novel, there are no accidents. There are mistakes. Writers make mistakes all the time, but there's no accident. Like it didn't accidentally fall onto the page. Someone had to put it there. The writer had to put it there. And so when I teach writing, it's like when you're doing it, I need you to be aware that you can't do anything casually. You can't just say, "Oh, well, that's not really what I meant," or "Oh, well, it didn't have to be there." No, you have to create the inevitability about it, and that is what leads into the authenticity that makes it so your reader can believe that what's happening is really happening, even though they know they're sitting in their living room reading a book, right? Like the willing suspension of disbelief is necessary in storytelling, because we have to say, like in theater, it's exactly like that. In the theater, you go into a room and you sit in a chair that's kind of uncomfortable, and you really wish you had more leg room. And someone's opening up their candy next to you, and it's too loud. But for when you're watching a play, the actors come on the stage, the lights come up, and they start doing stuff, and it's not real. These are actors acting parts, and yet if it's a good play and it's well done, by the end, you're so caught up in it, you believe that drama, you accept that drama. And it's shown, in fact, that when you read a book, they put MRIs on people and put probes in their brains and all that kind of stuff. When you read a book and there's something dangerous happening, like someone's about to fall off a cliff, the same parts of your brain are stimulated as if you were about to fall off a real cliff. So these are the things that we have in our repertoire as storytellers. So for me, the biggest one is, of course, The Art of Racing in the Rain was kind of my big hit. So it's easy to talk about. I deliberately put very specific, genuine, real places in that book for the purposes of convincing you that Enzo is a real dog with real thoughts and he's really telling you this story. Because dogs don't really tell us stories. We know that. But geez, we'd like to have any reason to believe that they do, don't we? And if I can hang it on some hooks that are really authentic, like Lakeview Cemetery, there's a scene in The Art of Racing in the Rain where the main character's wife has passed away. She's died of a brain cancer, and she's going to be buried and have a funeral in the ground, putting the coffin in the ground thing. And I set it in Lakeview Cemetery. That's a real live place on Capitol Hill, and people go there, and they go there for a reason, because all the great historical figureheads of Seattle are buried there. The Denny family, Arthur Denny, you can see their graves. But it's also kind of cool because that's where Bruce Lee is buried. And that's where Brandon Lee, his son, is buried. And people go and pay homage to these people. They bring them flowers. You go to their grave. You can go visit the cemetery and walk up to their grave, and you can pay your respects. And that tombstone will be covered with flowers of people who have come to pay homage to these people. And so I wanted to put that in there because that's a touchstone that people recognize. Even if you're not from Seattle, you could look it up on the internet and you could see it. Now, some stuff I have to shift around. Sometimes I got to make up a thing, or I got to move something. And then if someone has a problem with that, I say, well, sorry, I'm a novelist. I can move things if I want to. I'm not writing nonfiction here. But I do think that texture is really important. And that's part of the reason why Matt Southworth, my illustrator, and I work well together. When I saw him doing Stumptown, which takes place in Portland, I know enough of Portland, Oregon, to know what the bridges look like and everything. And I saw the way he drew his frames in Stumptown, and I was like, dude, I know exactly where that scene is taking place. I know the street that it's taking place on. And if I know that, then I'm engaged with the story, and I'm like, I want to know what's going to happen next. So I said to Matt, I want to put real locations in whenever we can. Let's go real. And he's been fantastic about it. We have a whole romping scene that goes through Volunteer Park and down to Waterfront Park and over to this, all over. We're using real locations, real signs, real, facade to put our characters into, so that you may recognize some of those iconic bits, and then you I mean, it's fiction, or is it?
Excellent. Just a reminder to those tuning in, please put any questions you have in the chat or question and answer boxes. Kind of tying back into something you said earlier within the Cloven about kind of the CRISPR technology.
Yeah.
And then there's also a mention within book 1 of epigenetics. What sort of research did you do into like genetics, genetic science, CRISPR technology, and epigenetics for the work that you did for the Cloven?
Yeah, I did quite a bit of research for me. I usually make it up first and then try and substantiate it. I did do quite a bit of research, and I happen to have a geneticist in my hip pocket. A good friend of mine, James Lyons Weiler, is a really cool scientist and who works in genetics, and I could consult him at any moment about what are the realities of what we're doing and all that. And, you know, CRISPR was developed very recently. CRISPR is this idea of being very targeted with gene editing. Previously, no one had that capability. CRISPR is a way of using. Well, we know what it is because it's essentially the mRNA technology that's being used in the vaccines for COVID, right? This idea of we're going to use a messenger RNA to go in and replace part of the DNA coding with the faulty part. We can replace it with another not faulty part. We can snip it and pick it out. We can edit, and it's a really cool idea. It turns out it's not as targeted as everyone kind of had hoped, but we're going to find that out in about 5 years. Because it also can, it turns out that once it does that, it'll do that. That's fine. Yeah, it'll go in and it'll clip that out and replace it. But then it's like, what should we do next? And it kind of goes rogue a little bit. It starts clipping and putting it in all sorts of other places in your DNA strands as well. And so that could end up not being so good, but we'll find out how our bodies start to take this on. So I did a lot of research into that sort of idea of what are the possibilities, or what is the horizon line of our, where are we headed? What is our goal? Where are we headed, and why are we headed there? And I'm trying to ask some certain ethical questions, like, just because we can do something, does that mean we should do something? There's a lot of science going on right now for science's sake, and that's okay. We have cool tools. We've got like all this great technology, and we're really smart. And so we can like have fun with this in a sense. We can mess around and see how far we can go. But at some point, we've got to attach a moral code to it in that, should we really be doing this? Should we get to the point where, I mean, Jamie Metzel is a writer who wrote a book called, oh shoot, something Darwin. It's about all of this stuff, and he's trying to foresee where we're headed with CRISPR technology. And he basically says we're heading toward a place where the idea that basically everyone will be, his future, Jamie Metzel, a scientist, a legitimate scientist, you can look him up right now online, Metzel, I believe it is, says, well, we're going to get to the point where creating a child out of the traditional method of man and woman is not needed anymore. And therefore, both sexes should be sort of neutered early on. At the proper, there's a perfect time where eggs should be harvested from a woman and sperm should be harvested from a man and frozen. And then you make your baby in the lab. Then you'll be rendered sterile and you can have all the free fun you want without having to worry about making a baby. And when you want to have a child, you'll go to the lab and you'll say, take out the eggs and take out the sperm, and we're going to create it. But we can alter the DNA that are in those things so that we can give you exactly what you want. You want a 6'5", 250-pound linebacker? Okay, we can do that. Do you want someone who can play the piano? We can do that. And we can kind of, it goes deep. If you check out his book, he's talking about going way deep, because the science right now is, we are at the point where technically we can do this. We can take a skin cell, I could take a skin cell off of me, create stem cells from that, believe it or not, and then create an opposite stem cell, and I could be the father and the mother of a child, like my DNA. That's freaky. And I'm not sure we should be doing it, quite frankly. And so I'm trying to challenge people to a degree in saying, we can have some fun with this, and let's do it like a comic book, and we'll like have some, we'll have some laughs, and we'll like say, oh, that's kind of crazy. It's not crazy. So when the stuff that we all think is crazy isn't crazy anymore, then where do we go? Then what do we do? So
Stephanie says she thinks the book is called Hacking Darwin.
Hacking Darwin. Yes, you're right. Actually, thank you, Stephanie. It's a great book. It's challenging. I mean, a great book. It's a very good book. I am very skeptical of some of his conclusions and some of his. I think that at the bottom line, people are going to be a little more sort of ethical than he presupposes. I'm not sure we're headed for that, but who knows?
I know, kind of going along with that, one thing that comes up a lot within the autism community is, there's moves and stuff to kind of edit the genetic code to get rid of autism, but there's a lot of ties between autism and art and science and some of the, different, what could be some of the unexpected outcomes of, gene editing and what could come out of.
Yeah, certainly we're delving into things that do we really want to, mess with, what God has given us, quite frankly. I mean, is that our job to do that or not? And I don't have an answer. At some point, an answer is going to be delivered to us, because that's the way our society works, economics and so forth, So we'll be at a point where if we aren't aware of it, and if we don't make a decision about it, then we could find ourselves in a point where other people are making decisions for us. And is there going to be regulation on this? Is anybody going to be on top of this situation? Who's monitoring it for us? And do we trust those people? Are those the right people in charge? And I think that it's going to be very challenging. I would encourage people to not wait to be worried. You know what I mean? I think that it's important to stay up to date on this, on what the future parameters are going to be, because suddenly we could be all, looking down something saying, when did that happen, and why did we let that happen? And people are working hard at doing things, and we'll see where we get to in the end. Will there be a hybrid goat boys running around? Well, I'm not going to say no. I mean, it's technically possible. So.
And then kind of challenging people. Earlier on in book one, like Tuck escapes, he encounters quite a few different, like really abrasive personalities. At one point, he's defending himself against a store owner, and he says, quote, "You're not a bad person. You're simply the product of a world that feeds you lies and disinformation." Do you have a particular inspiration for store owner, and how does that kind of tie into this theme into the thematics that we've been talking about here?
Well, I mean, the dis of that is all relative in a sense, right? Because in that particular context, there's a town that's near this laboratory where this stuff is going down. And the town is on economic hardship. You know, the town is not doing well. And he even says, there's a line in there where he says, you know, the newspaper used to sponsor our fireworks, but hold on a second. I'm gonna do a Zoom thing. I'm gonna move. My wife and kid came home and they're making, here we go. Okay. Welcome to the secret room. I still got a brick wall though. The idea of disinformation is relative, I have to be honest, and it's being used quite a bit in propaganda right now and in the news and so forth. They say this is disinformation and that's disinformation, and we've become entirely polarized, as you know, in this world especially around COVID and all that, and who is telling the truth and who isn't. And just because one person says the other person is disinformation doesn't mean the other person isn't saying that person is disinformation. And which information are we supposed to get and which aren't we? And I would suggest to you that the best way is to go to the source and to actually, try and find the source material, because I think that a lot of what's being pumped out in the media is being highly manipulated right now by interests, but of any kind, by corporate, by government, by pharmaceutical, by left wing, by right wing. Everybody's got their agenda, and everybody's trying to say the other people are wrong. And so we're at a point where we're in a kaleidoscope of what can you depend on? You flip on. In the old days, you turned on the news and Walter Cronkite gave you the truth. Well, that doesn't exist anymore. There is no more flipping on the television and getting the truth. The only way is to try to dig into it yourself. We have to get to a point where, and this is part of the theme of the Cloven, but I think it's also secretly kind of a part of the theme of all my books, which is we have to be responsible for our own conclusions, our own thoughts, our own ability to bring in information and kind of decide for ourselves what we believe is the true aspect. And I'm not trying to be partisan on any direction here, but I will say that this world has become so divided on partisan lines, it makes it very challenging for us to get through anything, because we're so busy thinking somebody else's must be lying to us. And we cling to something that there are all sorts of studies out there about repetition and about how small phrases that we hear more frequently get into our heads, and then that becomes a truth. There's stuff that's really interesting about the brain. I've been doing a lot of research into the brain. That's what I'm working on a new book that I'm working on, which interestingly will have a tie-in to the Cloven. But the idea of how brains deal with how your conscious understands what is a truth. And there's is it a one-step process or a two-step process? And it's very biological about synapses firing in different places in your brain and how the process works, and us trying to understand that. But the fact is that this is a very challenging time we're in, and I really do believe, as Enzo would believe, that we have to take charge of our own individual thoughts and beliefs, because giving it to someone else so
You're breaking up a little bit there.
Very cynical about pretty much everything in the world. Yeah, sorry, but that's the world we're living in right now.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be a downer or anything, but we do have to be awake. We have to be awake as individuals and not assign our look. We're dealing with it all the time and we're in the old days and with school, like you send your kid to school. There's a good thing about sending your kid to school, right? Because they're going someplace else. It's a social aspect. There's a social integration. They're learning different dynamics. But at the same time, who's controlling the curriculum? And that's a big thing right now, right? Now, when I was a kid, I was born in 1964. We just assumed that the school knew everything. The school knew what was right and what was wrong, and they could teach us the moral code and the ethical code and everything else. And now we're like, well, wait a second, who wrote the school? Who wrote the curriculum? And who wrote the morals? And how? So now we're like trying to dig in a little bit more. So does that mean, is that all because of we have more information at our hands? Well, yeah, probably. Because of the internet, we can do more research, we can dig into things, we can ask more questions. Yeah, probably. Do we have to be very careful about where we're digging and what questions we're asking? Yes. That it gives while that information is going to be so vast and wonderful that we can have at our disposal, we as individuals have to be responsible about what we're doing in that world. You can't just go and say, oh, it looks like water to me, it must be a swimming pool, but it actually is the Pacific Ocean. They're two different things. We have to be able to be aware and not just say I'm going to jump because someone said no, it's safe to jump. I'm not going to jump. I mean, there's dangers out there. The Pacific Ocean is dangerous. They call it Pacific. It's not.
But, so to everyone listening in, so we're gonna slowly wind up. If you've got any final questions, please put them in the chat or the question and answer box. So you mentioned the novel you're working on in book 2 of the Cloven. So what projects do you have coming up that you're particularly excited about? Are those the 2 main projects? And can you give us a little taste?
Yeah. There are 2. Those are my main things. The Cloven. Matt and I are still working on, and we're very excited. I mean, it's going to be great, but as I say, drawing takes longer than writing words. And then I'm working on a novel, which is I want to challenge people on these very kind of topics that we're talking about. And so we're dealing with how do I say it without this is the problem when you're working on a book, you got a basically everything you see is through a magnifying glass, so I'm working on this one thing and I say, oh, it's about this, but it's not really about that. It's about other stuff. But I will say that you guys all know who Elon Musk is and all that, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's got a lot of projects. He likes starting new projects and stuff, and he's been and putting brain chips in them to see if they can play video games without using their hands, just by using their brain impulses, and they can. And this is great technology because it means that we might be able to help people who've had, severe and traumatic spinal cord injuries. In a sense, we could bypass their spinal cord where the injuries occurred by using electronics to kind of communicate between the severed parts. If that can work, that's amazing and revolutionary and staggering and positive and good, no question. However, when Elon Musk gets on stage to say, I'm looking at this, they say, well, what else can that thing do? And he's like, well, essentially, it would be like having an iPhone implanted in your brain. So you could make calls, you could text without using your fingers. Everything could be done internally inside your brain if we had the right brain chip implanted. That is scary. So helping people with spinal cord injuries to be able to move their feet again or move their hands again. Oh my God, amazing. We have to do that. Implanting iPhones into people's brains. I'm nervous about that, because what's next after that? Are we really going down that world of Blade Runner and William Gibson Neuromancer and all these ideas of what's the book where you have your consciousness is stored and then you get put into a new body by putting it in your spinal column, so that your body is called a sleeve instead of a body. I mean, is that where we're headed? We live for our consciousness lives for hundreds of years and we just have synthetic bodies we get dropped into. I'm not sure that's the human experience, but maybe it is. Some people would argue that's the next evolution of humanity, is to exist without a body. I don't know. I'm not sure we're ready for that, but I think that we better think about it, because the technology is moving faster than we are, right? So just because we may be reluctant, but there are computer scientists out there working right now on doing it. So if they get it done and we're reluctant, then where are we? Then we're just not prepared. And then it's someone else's decision. And then we've outsourced the responsibility for our own destiny again.
That's interesting.
Not to be dark, like we got to say something nice and light right now. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that actually ties in with some recent science fiction works. I can't recall the author's name, but there's a book called We Are Satellites that kind of similarly plays on a technology where it becomes common for kids to get what are called brain pals, and it helps them to multitask, because it's a chip that helps them recircuit their brain to do multiple things all at once.
Yeah.
So and people consequences.
People mess with it in fiction quite a bit, and another is Feed. There's a great book called Feed. I can't remember the author either. I can't remember the author's name, but Andrews or something like that. But and the idea is that these young people are sitting around talking to each other, but they're also texting each other privately in their brains. Like they're doing two conversations at the same time, which of course only a young person could do, right? Like as an old person, I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't look at my phone and have a conversation, but my 14-year-old can. Because he's able to bifurcate his brain in some way where he does it. I don't know if I say that's not convincing to me, but it's effective. And so what's the next? Where are we just outmoded? We old people who read books in paper form, are we just like, they're just waiting for us to die off so that they can have more space to have their computer chips? I don't know. But none of this stuff is what used to be science fiction is science speculation right now. So that's what I'm trying. I think I need to be in that world because I have a unique. If I can get it right, I think it's good, because I am read by people who read paper books. People still go to my local bookstore to buy the hardcover of The Art of Racing in the Rain, for instance. Whereas, all of my kids, I don't have, my oldest kid is 25. I don't think any of my kids read, well, one of my kids reads paper, but two of my kids they read everything on their computer or on their phone. They're just digital people. They read Kindle or, whatever, Kobo or whatever other digital medium they have, because they're just more comfortable in that world. As a non-native computer user, I still like going back to the old ways, but I think I can ring that alarm, or at least focus some attention on things for people like me, who may be concerned with sort of what is our moral and ethical through line as human beings, and are we compromising it by allowing technology to outpace our sort of ability to evolve as humans. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, and I'm definitely looking forward to it. Stephanie said so as well. Kind of my favorite subgenre is that speculative science, near future sci-fi, where you do deal with a lot of these things that are happening and have implications in the near future. So that's exciting, and you've definitely got an audience here at Desert Foothills for that.
Oh, well, good. Well, I look, having been to Cave Creek and all that, and know the area, it's a lovely place, and I haven't been there for years. I was there. There was a bookstore. I don't know if it's still there. And I went and did a reading there. It was a very cool bookstore, and I think it was pretty new when I read there. But I love the area and sort of the beauty of that part of Arizona. Really enjoyed being there.
We would definitely love to have you visit again. The library is actually like up on a hill, so you can see pretty much the entire town from our library. So it's beautiful.
Nice.
So to wrap it up, one question I like to ask, and this is definitely kind of a slightly happier question. So, we all of the things happening in the world and all of the great problems. If you could be asked one thing about your career, what would it be? So when we talked to Jordan Ifweko, she had a real interest into fabrics, which she talked about in little bits and pieces in her novels. And she wished people would talk to her about fabrics.
Fabrics?
Yeah.
Textiles. That's interesting. Yeah. I had like something that was a little overlooked or something. I don't know that I have any particular topic. My books are all kind of different, but for me they're all the same. But the thematically for me they're all the same. But I think contextually they're all different. And I guess it would be about the spiritual aspect. I think that's something that is easy to take lightly in the book that I wrote that was most popular, which is The Art of Racing in the Rain. But if you look at all the books that I've written, there's always a very strong spiritual element to it, and that's really where I'm kind of focusing in right now, which is this idea of we can deal with the trappings and the facade and the layering, the laminate of technology, but at the bottom line, who are we and why are we here? And I think that's a spiritual question. I don't think that's an intellectual question. So I think that if anything, I hope people, when they read my stuff, feel or think about sort of their mission, their individual mission in life. We're not here by accident, and maybe there's something that we need to. It's easy to be lazy, as we all know. It's easy to say, "Oh, I'll deal with this tomorrow," or this is something I don't. It's not. I'll let someone else take care of that. That's going to be taken care of for me, and I guess I would like people to ask me and talk to me about like that sort of personal, responsibility, the personal ethic, and this personal spiritual journey that we all are on, and how we sort of like interface with our world with that in mind. That is not a short answer.
But it's a great
fabrics. I wish I could have said fabrics.
Her answer was actually quite involved because
good.
Fabric plays an important role in quite a few.
But in a sense, it is. I mean, I could totally see that as a metaphor, right? Because the weavings and the way the threads go, and everyone is dependent on each other, and the look from a distance is different from the look up close. It's kind of the same answer. So I didn't mean to demean that or in any way kind of put that down. I just said it's like it just reminded me when you said that of one of the greatest movies, of course, of all time. And you all should watch the documentary on Mike Nichols, that I think is on, it might be on HBO. I think they made it or something. But The Graduate. The great line in The Graduate where old Dustin Hoffman is a child, as a youth, and the guy corners him at that early scene and says, "Plastics, one word, plastics." So I wish the world could be reduced to one word: plastics, or fabrics, or cybernetics, or CRISPR, but it can't be. It's our world is way too multifaceted for a simple answer. And I guess all I would do is encourage everybody to take in the facets, and understand that nothing's wrong. It's just a different reflection that maybe you didn't expect, So
I think that is a wonderful place to end. You've definitely given us a lot to think about, and we really appreciate that. There are a couple people in the audience who said, they'd love to have you come back and visit Cave Creek. So you're definitely welcome here anytime. And Deborah kind of ends us off with, I think, a great comment that it's so great to hear from an author on the backstory. This was great, and thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
It's my pleasure. It was great talking to you. I mean, I feel that, look, I don't like, I try not to do Zoom. I really do, because for me, I don't get, I like to be in a room with people and see their faces and see their body language and understand if they're falling asleep, I got to do something, or if they're laughing, I should do more of that. And that personal interaction for me is very important. And so this whole COVID lockdown and all that, and I haven't been able to travel, and I haven't been able to come to Cave Creek, I haven't been able to be there in the library. That's very frustrating to me. And it's been a real challenge, kind of, as a writer. So while I love this technology and this is all good, I do make a commitment to come back and see everybody. I hope everyone will come out and see me if they're there, and say hello. And because I do look at someone in the eyes and shaking their hand and saying hello is very important to the human experience. So I hope we get back to that soon.
Agreed. And I do hope we get back to that soon. Well, thank you so much again. And it was a pleasure having you. So we'll log off, but just thank you for your time. And thank you so much for everything that you've, talked with us about today, and just the wonderful depth to all of your answers.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.